I said it like you say things you don't expect anyone to hold on to. We were in the hallway. It was a Wednesday evening in October, and she had just told me she'd never been to Paris. I said, without thinking, "The way you reach for something when a conversation needs a soft landing." I said, "Well, I'll take you sometime." And she laughed. I laughed. We went back to our separate apartments, and I forgot about it inside of 10 minutes. She did not forget about it. 3 days later, she knocked on my door with a suitcase. Not a large one. A carry-on olive green with a small tag tied to the handle. She was wearing her coat. She said. I looked up flights. There's one Friday morning. I packed for 4 days. I stood in the doorway for what was probably too long to be normal. She said, "You did say sometime." I said, "I meant it more as an expression." She looked at me steadily and said, "I know. But I've been to every continent except Europe, and I've wanted to go for 11 years, and you offered, and I decided to take you seriously. So, are we going or not?" There was a version of me that said no. That version did not survive contact with her expression. My name is Jonas Reeve. I'm 35. I design packaging, the structural engineering of boxes, bottles, containers, anything that holds something and needs to hold it well. It is a job people find surprising and then interesting once they understand that every object they've ever held was designed by someone in a room very much like mine. I live in apartment 3D of a building on Whitmore Avenue. I've been there 2 years. I am a person who says things he means, but occasionally underestimates how literally other people receive them. I have been told, this is endearing. I have also been told it creates confusion. Both assessments are accurate. Her name was Petra Vance. She was 33. She was a documentary researcher. She found things, people, places, photographs, documents that had been misfiled or forgotten or deliberately hidden. She found them and brought them back into the light and handed them to someone with a camera. She had a habit of looking at whatever room she was in the way she probably looked at archives, cataloging, assessing, deciding what mattered. She had dark eyes that didn't miss much and didn't pretend to. She had a very small scar above her left eyebrow from a bicycle accident in her 20s that she had mentioned once and never again. She had a jade plant on her balcony that she had named after a French novelist. She said he would have found the gesture ironic. Her name for the plant was Flaubert. I found this out during our first real conversation, which happened because the 2 balconies were adjacent, and she was talking to the plant when I came out for air one Sunday morning, and I said, "Who are you talking to?" And she said, "Flaubert, obviously." And somehow we were still talking an hour later. By the end of it, I knew she had been to 6 continents, was afraid of pigeons specifically and not birds in general, and had strong opinions about the structural weaknesses of cardboard boxes, which I had validated professionally, and which she had seemed to find both satisfying and slightly alarming. The dynamic we had established over 14 months was this: easy, warm, and more honest than most things I had at that point in my life. She had a way of saying what she thought without making it feel like an accusation. I had a way of listening that she told me once was unusual, which I took as a compliment, and which she probably meant as one. We ate dinner together sometimes, when neither of us had other plans, which had become most of the time. We watched films she chose and argued about them afterward, which was, I had come to understand, the point. She chose films precisely because she wanted to argue about them. I had started choosing better arguments because she deserved them. I told myself this was friendship. Friendship with particulars. Friendship with a jade plant called Flaubert and adjacent balconies, and the specific warmth of a person who was honest with you and expected you to be honest back. I had not been fully honest. Not about all of it. She had mentioned Paris several times in the 14 months. Not obsessively, not with longing exactly. More the way you mention a country on a map that keeps drawing your eye. She had covered the Normandy landings for a documentary 2 years before I knew her. She had researched the liberation of Paris for another. She knew the streets of the 4th arrondissement from photographs and records, and the accounts of people who had walked them. She had never walked them herself. I knew all of this because I paid attention. I paid more attention than the category of neighbor required. I had filed most of this under research for a conversation I would have with her eventually, once I had figured out what the conversation was supposed to be about. There was an evening in July when she came back from a long research trip and knocked on my door without calling first, which she never did, and when I opened it, she was exhausted in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that comes from having looked very hard at difficult things for weeks on end. She said, "I just wanted to know someone was home." I said, "Come in." She came in. We sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes eating takeout from the bag without plates because the table was covered in my project files, and she told me about what she'd been researching: a camp, a dispersal, a family that had documented everything and then lost the documents, and I listened to all of it, and at the end she said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For not trying to fix it." That sentence sat in me for weeks. There was the afternoon in September when I was working on a particularly difficult structural problem, a container that had to hold opposing pressures without collapsing under either, and I had been staring at it for 4 hours when she appeared on the balcony with 2 coffees and said, "What's the problem?" I told her. She looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "You're trying to solve from the outside. What does it look like from inside the thing that needs holding?" I went back to my desk and solved it in an hour. I did not tell her this until 3 weeks later. She said, "I know. I heard you say finally through the wall." I said, "You could have said something." She said, "You needed to find it yourself." I have genuinely poor instincts for predicting what Petra Vance will do with something I hand her. This is one of the things I like most about her, and had been carefully not saying so for approximately 5 months. The joke in the hallway was not a joke. Entirely. I want to be honest about that now. It was something I meant, and dressed in lightness, because the full weight of it felt too much to put in a Wednesday evening hallway. She had told me she'd never been, and something in me had wanted immediately to fix that. Not because Paris needed fixing, but because she was someone who had helped fix everything for everyone else's stories, and had not yet gotten to live inside her own. I said it like a joke. She heard something underneath it. She went home and looked up flights. I have poor instincts for predicting what Petra Vance will do with something I say. This is one of the things I like most about her. I went. The flight was 7 hours, and we sat next to each other, and she slept for the first 4 hours with her head at an angle that suggested complete trust in the structural integrity of airplane seats, which I found both endearing and useful, because it gave me 4 hours to look out the window and think about what exactly I had agreed to. We had agreed, explicitly, to a trip. We had not agreed, explicitly, to anything else. I was aware that the space between those 2 agreements was large, and that I was sitting in the middle of it at 30,000 feet, with her sleeping beside me, and a carry-on bag full of clothes she had packed in 40 minutes, because she had decided to take me seriously. This was not a recommended decision framework for international travel. I had made it. I was committed to it. At some point over the Atlantic, she woke up and looked out the window for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, "I should tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I almost didn't knock." I packed the bag, and I sat with it for 2 hours looking at it, and almost talked myself out of the whole thing. And then I thought, If I don't knock, in 6 months I'll be exactly where I am now, except I'll also know I was too careful. And that seemed worse. I said, I'm glad you knocked. She said, I know. She said, that's why I did. She went back to sleep. I looked out the window at the dark Atlantic below us and thought about the word careful, about the difference between being careful and being afraid, and which of those I had been for 5 months. She woke up again over the coast of France and immediately said, Tell me something about packaging that you've never told anyone. I said, every time I design something that holds a thing securely, I'm solving a problem that's also a little bit about love. She went quiet for a moment. She said, That's the least funny sentence about boxes I've ever heard. I said, I know. She said, I mean that as a compliment. I said, I know. Paris in October is a particular thing, cold at the edges of the day, warm at the middle of it, the light arriving sideways and staying low. We landed on Friday morning and took the train into the city, and she looked out the window with the expression of someone arriving at a place they have known in another form for a long time. Not surprised, recognizing. She said very little, until we came into the station, and then she said, It looks exactly right. I did not ask what she meant. I understood what she meant. We stayed in a small hotel in the 11th arrondissement because she had found it in an account she was researching. A woman who had stayed there in 1944 and written about the view from the 3rd floor, and she had wanted to see the view herself. The room was small and had 2 beds, and she stood at the window for a long time the first evening looking at the street below, and I sat on the edge of one of the beds and watched her look, which I had done many times before, but not in Paris, which felt different. We walked that first afternoon without a plan, which was not how Petra Vance moved through the world in a professional capacity, but was, she told me, how she liked to move through cities the first time. Open-handed, no itinerary, just the streets and whatever they offered. She stopped at a courtyard off the Rue Saint-Antoine and stood in the middle of it for a full 2 minutes without speaking, looking at the walls and the light and the windows, and I stood beside her and also looked, and I thought, I have been standing beside this person for 14 months, and I have not been honest about what that means to me, and I am standing in a courtyard in Paris, and I am not going to wait much longer. She bought a curp from a street vendor and ate half of it, and handed me the other half without asking if I wanted it, which she had done with food many times before, a shared thing, offered without ceremony. The curp was warm, and the street smelled like autumn and coffee and stone, and she was already looking at the next block, already orienting, already finding what was worth finding. I had a thought that I had been having in various forms for 5 months, which was, I do not want to be adjacent to her life. I want to be in it. She said, without turning, Thank you for taking me seriously. I said, You gave me no other option. She said, I gave you 17 other options. You could have made any of them. I said, I know. She turned from the window. She looked at me the way she looked at archives, deciding what mattered, what to bring back into the light. She said, Can I ask you something? I said, Yes. She said, Did you mean it as a joke? I looked at her. The street below was doing its Friday evening things, voices and a scooter and someone laughing a floor below us. I said, I meant it dressed as a joke. Those are different things. She said, I know they are. That's why I packed. Something in the room shifted. Not the room, me in it. Something in my chest that had been patient for 14 months and had just run out of a reason to stay that way. I said, You've been finding things for other people's stories for your entire career. She said, Yes. I said I would like to be in your story. Not as an incidental fact, Not as the neighbor in 3D. I would like that very much, and I have not known how to say it for most of the 14 months I've known you. She went still. I said, if you want to have 4 days in Paris and come home and be neighborly about all of this, say so. I'll make that work. I'll manage. She looked at me for a long moment. The lamp behind her was casting the room amber, and outside the city was doing what Paris in October does, and she was standing at the window in her coat with her olive suitcase open on the bed, and she said, Jonas. I looked up flights 3 days after a hallway conversation. I have 17 years of professional experience deciding what is worth pursuing and what is not. I packed in 40 minutes. I said, I know. She said, I have been waiting for you to say something true for 5 months. I said, 5 months. She said, I noticed in April. You were on the balcony, and you were talking to Flaubert because I was running late, and you thought I wasn't home yet. And you were telling him, very seriously, about a packaging problem you were working on. And I stood inside the door and listened for 4 minutes before I made a noise to let you know I was there. And I thought, that is a person I would like to know everything about. I said, I talk to the plant occasionally. She said, I know. I find it very useful data. She stepped away from the window. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of me and she tilted her head slightly, that particular tilt she used when she was filing something into the category of things worth keeping, and she said, Tell me something true. I said, I have thought about you every morning for over a year. When I said Paris in the hallway, I was not making a joke. I was making a wish out loud and calling it a joke, because I didn't know yet if you were someone who wanted to be in the same wish. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I packed Flaubert a cutting. He's in a small cup in my bag. I wasn't going to leave him for 4 days without checking on him, and I didn't think you'd mind, and also I wanted him to see Paris. I said, that is the most you thing you have ever said to me. She said, yes. She said, I'm in the same wish, Jonas. I've been in it since April. She leaned forward and she kissed me, quietly, without ceremony. The way she did everything that mattered, as though the decision had been made long before the action, and the action was simply the natural end of the thought. Outside the window, Paris continued being October. Below us, someone was still laughing. The room was warm, and the lamp was amber, and Flaubert the plant was in a small cup in an olive suitcase, and we stayed in that room for a long time before we went out to walk the streets she had only ever known from photographs. She had brought a small notebook. She wrote nothing in it. She held my hand instead. The documentary she was researching at the time had nothing to do with Paris, but she took photographs of the 4th arrondissement anyway, on a disposable camera she bought from a tabak on Saturday morning. She didn't explain why until months later, when I found the photographs developed and pinned above her desk at home. The streets, the light, a brasserie we'd eaten at on Sunday evening, and one of me looking at a window display of packaging in a shop on the Rue de Rivoli, not knowing she had taken it. She said, I needed the record, in case you forgot what your face looked like when you were exactly where you were supposed to be. I said, I wouldn't have forgotten. She said, I know. I wanted it anyway. A year after that, when people asked how we got together, I told the hallway version, the joke, the 3 days, the suitcase at the door. People always laughed at the suitcase. She would let them laugh and then she would say, he meant it. He just didn't know yet whether I was listening. I always said, I knew she was listening. That's why I said it. She always said, that is a significant revision of events. I always said, it's the true version. The other one is just the order things happened in. We still argue about it. It is one of my favorite arguments. She always wins it, and I am always glad she does. Nothing had been missing. It had simply been waiting for one of us to say a true thing dressed as a joke, and the other to show up 3 days later with a packed suitcase and a plant cutting, and the absolute refusal to pretend she hadn't been listening all along. What would you have done if someone took a joke seriously enough to pack a bag? And have you ever said something you meant as a wish and called it a joke because the full weight of it felt too much for the hallway? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.